The morning Sarah Bennett stood in front of the dilapidated Victorian house on Elm Street, she felt her stomach drop. The paint was peeling in long, gray strips, the porch sagged dangerously to one side, and every window was either cracked or completely shattered. Her 7-year-old daughter Emma clutched her hand tightly, staring up at the structure with wide eyes. This was it. This was the house Sarah had bought at a county tax auction for exactly $1, plus back taxes and fees. Her entire savings gone. Her last desperate attempt to give her daughter a stable home after years of struggling in cramped apartments and shelters. "Mom, it looks haunted," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Sarah forced a smile she didn't feel. "It's not haunted, sweetie. It's just old. We're going to fix it up and make it beautiful." But as she stared at the overgrown yard, the collapsing fence, and the dark, gaping doorway, Sarah wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The real estate agent had warned her. The neighbors had whispered. Even the clerk at the county office had given her a pitying look when she signed the papers. This house had been abandoned for over 30 years, ever since its elderly owner had passed away with no heirs. It had sat empty, decaying, becoming a neighborhood eyesore that no one wanted to touch. Sarah had no choice. With her wages from 2 jobs barely covering rent and food, home ownership had seemed like an impossible dream. Until she'd stumbled across the auction listing online at 2 a.m, exhausted from her shift at the diner, scrolling through her phone while Emma slept beside her in their studio apartment. $1 starting bid. She'd researched frantically, calculated every penny she had saved, and placed her bid with shaking hands. Now, standing here in the harsh October sunlight, reality hit her like a physical blow. Before we continue with Sarah's incredible journey, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Sarah took a deep breath and squeezed Emma's hand. "Come on, baby. Let's go see our new home." The front steps creaked ominously under their weight. Sarah tested each one carefully before letting Emma follow. The front door hung partially open, its lock long since broken. She pushed it wider, and the hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the empty neighborhood. Inside, the house was worse than she'd imagined. Dust hung thick in the air, visible in the streams of sunlight that pierced through the broken windows. The wooden floors were warped and stained, the wallpaper hung in long, moldy strips, and the smell of decay and abandonment was overwhelming. Sarah covered her nose and mouth with her sleeve, guiding Emma carefully across the unstable floor. They moved through the first floor slowly. The living room was filled with ancient, moth-eaten furniture covered in decades of dust. The kitchen was a nightmare of rusted appliances and cabinets hanging off their hinges. Water damage had created dark stains across the ceiling, and in some places, Sarah could see clear through to the second floor. "We can't live here, Mom," Emma said quietly, her eyes filling with tears. "Can we go back to Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment?" Sarah knelt down, ignoring the dust that clung to her jeans. "We can't, sweetie. Mrs. Rodriguez needed to rent to someone else, remember? But this is going to be okay, I promise. We'll start with one room, make it safe and clean, and we'll camp out together like an adventure. Then we'll do another room, and another, until the whole house is fixed up." Emma nodded, but tears still streamed down her cheeks. Sarah pulled her daughter close, fighting her own despair. She had 3 weeks before Emma's school started. 3 weeks to make at least one room livable. 3 weeks to prove she hadn't destroyed their lives with this desperate gamble. Over the next 2 days, Sarah worked like someone possessed. She borrowed a generator and work lights from her friend Marcus, who managed a construction site. She bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find, industrial masks and heavy gloves. When Emma was at her grandmother's house, Sarah would work from dawn until midnight, hauling out mountains of trash, scrubbing surfaces until her hands bled, boarding up the most dangerous areas. The neighbors watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Mrs. Chen from across the street brought over sandwiches on the second day. "You're brave," she said, her accent thick but her eyes kind. "This house, everyone afraid of it. Say it cursed because old man who lived here, he die alone? No family come?" "I don't believe in curses," Sarah replied, accepting the food gratefully. "Just bad luck, and my luck is about to change." Mrs. Chen smiled sadly, but Sarah could see she didn't believe it. By the end of the first week, Sarah had managed to make the smallest bedroom on the second floor marginally habitable. She'd scrubbed every surface with bleach, covered the walls with cheap primer, and installed a basic lock on the door. She'd found 2 old mattresses by a dumpster, cleaned them thoroughly, and set them up on the floor with their few possessions. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Emma tried to be brave, but Sarah could see the fear in her daughter's eyes every time a floorboard creaked or the wind rattled the broken windows. At night, they huddled together under blankets, and Sarah told stories about how beautiful the house would be someday, with painted walls and fixed floors and a garden full of flowers. On the third night, Emma woke up screaming. Sarah held her trembling daughter, feeling her small body shake with sobs. There were sounds, Mom. Scratching sounds in the walls. Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. It's probably just mice or squirrels, sweetie. Old houses have animals living in them sometimes. We'll get that taken care of, I promise. But Emma wasn't comforted. What if we can't fix it? What if we're stuck here forever in this scary place? The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut because she'd been asking herself the same thing. What if she'd miscalculated? What if the house was beyond her ability to repair? What if she'd traded their cramped but safe apartment for a nightmare they couldn't escape? Listen to me, Sarah said, cupping Emma's face in her hands. Remember when you were learning to ride your bike and you fell and scraped your knee? You wanted to give up, but I told you that sometimes the things worth having are the things we have to work hardest for. This house is like that bike. It's scary right now, and we're going to have some falls and some scrapes, but we're going to get through this together. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. Will you stay awake with me? Sarah held her daughter until she fell back asleep, staring at the cracked ceiling and the dim light from their single lamp. She counted the money left in her wallet. $43. The electricity bill was due in 2 days. Emma needed new shoes for school. The plumbing still didn't work properly. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. She couldn't afford to panic. She was all Emma had. So Sarah did what she always did when fear threatened to paralyze her. She made a plan. She'd ask Tony for extra shifts at the diner. She'd call the utility company and beg for an extension on the bill. She'd fix what she could with her own hands and improvise solutions for the rest. Somehow, they would make it work. The next morning brought new challenges. When Sarah tried to use the kitchen sink, the pipes groaned and shuddered, but no water came out. She went down to the basement to investigate, her flashlight revealing a burst pipe that had flooded a section of the concrete floor. The water was ankle-deep in places, and Sarah could see mold already forming on the lower portions of the wooden support beams. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. Instead, she rolled up her pants, waded through the cold water, and turned off the main water valve. Then she went upstairs, got Emma ready for her grandmother's house, and headed to the library to research how to fix a burst pipe with minimal money and tools. The librarian, a kind woman named Patricia, who'd helped Sarah before, noticed her distress. Rough day? Sarah laughed, but it came out more like a sob. Rough week? Rough month? Rough year, actually? Patricia listened as Sarah explained about the house, about the burst pipe, about the mounting problems that seemed to multiply faster than she could solve them. When Sarah finished, Patricia disappeared into the back room and returned with a stack of books on home repair and renovation. These are being decommissioned, Patricia said. Officially, I'm supposed to recycle them. Unofficially, I think you need them more than the recycling center does. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. I do, actually, Patricia replied gently. I was a single mother once, too. There were times I didn't think I'd make it. But we're stronger than we know, Sarah. You'll find a way. Armed with the books and a renewed sense of determination, Sarah spent the rest of the morning at the hardware store, talking to the employees about the cheapest ways to fix a burst pipe. One older man, a retired plumber named George, listened to her description of the problem and shook his head. You're going to need help with that one. But I'll tell you what. I'm retired, bored out of my mind, and my wife is tired of me pacing around the house. Give me your address. I'll come by this afternoon and take a look. No charge. Sarah stared at him. I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I offered. There's a difference. George smiled. Besides, I like a challenge. And from what you're describing, this house is definitely that. True to his word, George showed up that afternoon with a toolbox and a young man he introduced as his grandson Tyler. Together, they spent 3 hours in the basement replacing sections of pipe, reinforcing weak joints, and showing Sarah how to do basic plumbing repairs herself. The system is old, George explained as they worked, but it's salvageable. You're going to have problems here and there, but nothing you can't handle if you learn the basics. Tyler here is studying to be a plumber. He can use the practice, and you can use the help. How about he stops by once a week to check on things and teach you what you need to know? Sarah wanted to hug them both. I don't know how to thank you. Fix up this house, George said simply. Make it a home. That's thanks enough. As word spread about Sarah's project, more people began to stop by. Some offered tools or materials, others offered advice or showed her how to do specific tasks. A retired teacher named Helen, who lived 2 streets over, heard about Emma's fear of the house and offered to tutor her after school, giving Sarah more time to work on renovations. But not everyone was supportive. One neighbor, Mr. Patterson, complained loudly about the eyesore in the neighborhood and threatened to report Sarah to code enforcement. He stood on his perfectly manicured lawn and shouted at her one afternoon while she was hauling debris to the curb. You're bringing down property values, he yelled. That house should be condemned, not lived in. Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment, but before she could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared from across the street. Mr. Patterson, you complain about everything, Mrs. Chen said firmly. This girl trying to make good life for her daughter? You should help, not make problems. It's a safety hazard, Mr. Patterson insisted. What if it collapses? What if there's a fire? Then we help, Mrs. Chen replied. That's what neighbors do. Now go home and leave her alone. Mr. Patterson stalked off, muttering under his breath, but Sarah noticed he didn't call code enforcement. Instead, a few days later, she found a bag on her porch containing work gloves, safety goggles, and a note that simply said, "Be careful." It wasn't signed, but Sarah recognized the handwriting from neighborhood flyers Mr. Patterson had distributed about keeping lawns maintained. The money was draining away faster than Sarah had anticipated. The back taxes had been higher than expected. She needed to pay for electricity to be turned on, for a water service to be restored. Every trip to the hardware store meant choosing between fixing the house and feeding Emma properly. Sarah started skipping meals, telling her daughter she'd eaten at work, watching Emma's face instead of the food she so desperately wanted. Her boss at the diner, Tony, noticed her exhaustion. "You look like death, Sarah. What's going on?" She explained about the house, about her plans, about the struggle to make it work. Tony listened, his weathered face thoughtful. "I've got some old tools in my garage," he said finally. "And my brother-in-law has a truck full of leftover materials from his jobs. Let me make some calls." By the second week, a small network of support had begun to form. Tony brought tools and showed her how to use them properly. His brother-in-law, Julio, delivered wood, drywall, and paint that would have otherwise gone to waste. Marcus stopped by after his shifts to help with the heavier work, refusing payment. Even Mrs. Chen organized the other neighbors to bring meals, saying Sarah needed strength to work. Sarah was overwhelmed by the kindness. She'd spent so long struggling alone, pushing away help out of pride, that she'd forgotten what community could feel like. Each evening, when the helpers left and she locked herself and Emma into their small, safe room, she felt a tiny spark of hope beginning to grow. But the house still held its secrets. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks into the renovation, when Sarah finally decided to tackle the basement. She'd been avoiding it, focusing on the upper floors, but she knew she couldn't put it off forever. The basement was essential for checking the foundation, the plumbing, the electrical systems. Everything that would determine whether this house could truly become a home or if it was beyond saving. She'd asked Marcus to come with her, but he'd had to work. Emma was at school. Sarah stood at the top of the basement stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness below, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The stairs were solid wood, surprisingly intact compared to the rest of the house. She tested each step carefully as she descended, the flashlight revealing stone walls covered in decades of spiderwebs and mold. The air grew colder and damper with each step, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. The basement was larger than she'd expected, extending under the entire footprint of the house. Ancient pipes ran along the ceiling, some wrapped in deteriorating insulation, others completely exposed and rusted. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, with puddles of stagnant water in the low spots. Wooden shelves lined 2 walls, sagging under the weight of old paint cans. Mason jars filled with unidentifiable contents, and cardboard boxes that had partially dissolved from moisture. Sarah moved carefully through the space, cataloging the work that would need to be done. The foundation looked surprisingly solid despite the neglect. The water damage seemed to come from broken pipes rather than structural issues. She made notes on her phone, calculating costs she couldn't afford but would somehow have to find. It was when she reached the far corner behind a collapsed shelving unit that she noticed something odd. The wall there looked different from the others, newer somehow, despite the dirt and mold. She moved closer, her flashlight revealing what appeared to be a section of wall that had been bricked up separately from the original construction. The mortar was a different color, the bricks a different size. Sarah's heart began to beat faster. In all the research she'd done on the house, she'd never found any mention of renovations or changes to the structure. The architectural plans on file with the county showed the basement as a single open space. She ran her hand over the bricks, feeling the rough texture, the gaps in the mortar. Without really thinking about what she was doing, she grabbed a rusty crowbar from the scattered tools on the floor and wedged it into one of the larger gaps. The mortar crumbled easily, decades old and weakened by moisture. One brick came loose, then another. Sarah worked faster, her curiosity overcoming her caution. Within minutes, she'd created a hole large enough to shine her flashlight through. The beam revealed another space beyond the wall, smaller and darker. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled away more bricks, making the opening large enough to climb through. Dust and debris fell around her, coating her hair and clothes. She should stop. She should call someone. But something drove her forward. a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this house held something more than decay and disappointment. She squeezed through the opening, her flashlight illuminating what appeared to be a small hidden room, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. The air was stale but dry, untouched by the moisture that plagued the rest of the basement, and stacked against every wall, piled nearly to the ceiling, were hundreds of boxes and cases. Sarah approached the nearest stack with trembling hands. The boxes were wooden, old but well constructed, with metal latches that had survived the decades intact. She opened the first one and gasped. Inside, nestled in individual compartments lined with faded velvet, were coins. Dozens of coins, glinting in her flashlight beam. She picked one up carefully, examining it in the light. It was heavy, clearly old, with unfamiliar markings and a date she could barely make out. 18-something. Her heart pounding, Sarah opened another box. More coins, different sizes and designs. Another box held what appeared to be paper currency, protected by some kind of waxy paper, the bills crisp and pristine despite their obvious age. A fourth box contained jewelry, brooches, rings, necklaces, all featuring intricate metalwork and stones that caught the light. Sarah sat down hard on the concrete floor, her mind reeling. She opened box after box, finding similar contents in each one. Coins, currency, jewelry, and in some of the larger cases, what appeared to be documents sealed in protective wrapping. Stock certificates, bonds, deeds to various properties. She had no idea what any of it was worth. She wasn't a historian or an expert in antiques. But even to her untrained eye, this collection represented something significant, something valuable, something that the old man who'd lived here had hidden away and taken the secret to his grave. Sarah's first instinct was to call the police. This couldn't be legally hers, could it? But as she sat in the dim basement, surrounded by decades of secrets, she thought about the months of research she'd done on the house. The old man, Harold Chen, Mrs. Chen's distant relative, had lived here alone for over 40 years. He'd been a recluse, barely leaving the house in his final years. When he died, the county had tried to locate family, had advertised in papers and online, had exhausted every avenue trying to find an heir. No one had come forward. No one had claimed him or his property. The house had eventually gone to tax auction because no one wanted it. No one cared about it. By every legal definition Sarah understood, this house and everything in it was now hers. But more importantly, she thought about Emma, about the opportunities this could provide, about the education, the security, the future that had always seemed so impossibly out of reach. Sarah carefully photographed everything, documenting the room and its contents methodically. Then she resealed the opening with the bricks, mixing fresh mortar from supplies Julio had left. She worked carefully, making sure the wall looked undisturbed, just another section of old basement masonry. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat with her laptop in their small room, researching. She learned about numismatics, about rare coins and their values. She found websites for estate appraisers and antique experts. She read about treasure troves and the legal complexities of found property. The more she learned, the faster her heart raced. Some of the coins she'd seen, based on dates and conditions, could be worth thousands each. The paper currency, if authentic, could be worth even more. The jewelry alone might represent a fortune. And the financial documents, if they were still valid or had historical value, could be priceless. But Sarah's research also revealed complicated legal territory. Found property laws varied by state. There were questions about abandoned versus hidden property, about the rights of previous owners' descendants, about tax implications and reporting requirements. Sarah realized she needed professional help, but good lawyers were expensive and she had no money to pay for one. She spent hours reading legal forms and articles, trying to understand her position. Some sources said that property purchased at auction included all contents unless specifically excluded. Others warned about treasure trove laws that could give governments or previous owners' heirs claims to valuable finds. Sarah's head spun with conflicting information. Around 3 a.m, exhausted and overwhelmed, Sarah allowed herself a moment of fantasy. What if the collection was worth enough to secure Emma's future? What if they could fix the house properly, with professionals instead of makeshift repairs? What if Emma could go to college without worrying about loans? What if Sarah never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying her daughter new clothes? But fantasy gave way to fear. What if someone challenged her claim? What if the discovery became public and she was robbed? What if she made a mistake in handling this and lost everything? Sarah had spent her entire adult life on the edge of financial disaster. The possibility of security terrified her almost as much as the continued struggle. She needed help, but she had to be careful. If word got out, if the wrong people learned about what she'd found, everything could be taken away. Sarah had learned through hard experience that the world was rarely kind to struggling single mothers. People would question her claim, her rights, her worthiness. She needed to do this right, legally and carefully, or risk losing everything. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to both her jobs, something she'd never done before. Her hands shook as she lied to Tony, telling him she had the flu. She hated dishonesty, but she couldn't explain the truth yet. Not until she understood what she was dealing with. She told Emma they were taking a special day trip for a surprise. They drove 2 hours to the city, to a law office she'd found through careful research. The attorney, Margaret Walters, specialized in property law and estate issues. Her reviews were impeccable, and she offered free initial consultations. The law office was in a gleaming downtown building, so different from Sarah's neighborhood that she felt out of place immediately. The receptionist looked at Sarah's worn jeans and Emma's hand-me-down clothes with barely concealed disdain. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked coolly. "Yes, Sarah Bennett, for the 11 o'clock consultation." The receptionist's expression softened slightly when she saw the name in the system. "Have a seat. Ms. Walters will be with you shortly." They waited in the elegant lobby for 20 minutes. Emma sat quietly, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, looking around at the expensive furniture and art with wide eyes. Sarah felt her courage wavering. What was she doing here? What if the attorney laughed at her? What if this was all a massive mistake? But then Margaret Walters emerged from her office, and Sarah's anxiety eased slightly. Margaret was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She didn't look at Sarah's clothes or make judgments about her appearance. She simply shook Sarah's hand and welcomed her back to her office. "My receptionist mentioned you have a property law question," Margaret said once they were seated. "Tell me what's going on." Sarah had rehearsed this conversation in her head dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, she struggled to find the words. She started with the house purchase, explaining the auction, the condition of the property, the work she'd been doing. Margaret listened attentively, taking notes. Then Sarah took a deep breath and described the discovery in the basement. She showed Margaret the photographs on her phone, watched the attorney's expression shift from polite interest to genuine surprise, then to careful neutrality. Margaret listened to Sarah's story with an increasingly interested expression. She asked detailed questions about the house purchase, the documentation, the discovery of the hidden room. When Sarah showed her the photographs, Margaret's eyebrows rose sharply. "Ms. Bennett, you may have stumbled onto something quite significant," Margaret said carefully. "But we need to proceed methodically. First, we need to establish beyond any doubt that the property and its contents are legally yours. I'll need to review all your purchase documents, conduct a thorough title search, and verify that no other claims exist on the property or estate." "Will that cost a lot?" Sarah asked, her voice small. She had maybe $300 left to her name. Margaret studied her for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Sarah could almost see the attorney weighing something in her mind. Finally, Margaret leaned forward, her hands clasped on her desk. "Let me tell you something about myself," Margaret said. 25 years ago, I was in law school with mountains of debt and a mother who was dying of cancer. I was about to drop out because I couldn't afford to continue. A professor took me aside and told me she'd cover my tuition for the final year. She said that one day, when I was established and successful, I should pay it forward by helping someone who needed it. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't trust herself to speak. "I've been practicing law for over 2 decades now," Margaret continued. "I've helped wealthy clients protect their assets, assisted corporations with mergers, handled estate planning for families with more money than they know what to do with. It's been lucrative, but sometimes I wonder if I'm honoring that professor's gift by only helping people who can afford my rates." Margaret pulled out a contract from her desk drawer. "I'll tell you what, I'm going to take this case on contingency. If the collection proves valuable and you're able to legally claim it, my fee will come from those proceeds. If not, you owe me nothing but the filing fees, which I estimate will be around $500. This is too interesting to pass up, and honestly, I admire what you're trying to do for your daughter." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." "I think I do," Margaret replied with a smile. "Now, let's get to work. I need copies of all your purchase documents, any correspondence with the county, and detailed photographs of everything in that hidden room. And Sarah, until we establish your legal claim definitively, don't tell anyone else about this. Not friends, not family, not your neighbors. The more people who know, the more complicated this becomes." Over the next month, Sarah continued working on the house while Margaret worked on the legal aspects. The attorney proved to be thorough and brilliant. She discovered that Harold Chen had indeed died in state without a will. An extensive search had been conducted for heirs, advertising in multiple states and even internationally, as Chen had emigrated from Taiwan in the 1950s. No one had responded. The property had been legally abandoned and subsequently sold to Sarah through proper channels. Furthermore, Margaret found records showing that Harold Chen had been a successful businessman in his youth, running an import-export company that dealt in Asian antiques and collectibles. He'd sold the business in the late 1970s and become increasingly reclusive. There were no records of him liquidating his personal collection, which explained the hidden room. He'd apparently walled up his treasures and simply left them there, a secret he'd kept until his death. Everything in that house is legally yours, Margaret told Sarah in early November. But now we need to determine what exactly you have and its value. They brought in experts, sworn to confidentiality through legal agreements Margaret crafted carefully. A numismatist from the State University examined the coins over several days, his excitement growing with each box he opened. A currency expert authenticated the paper money, some of it dating back to the Civil War era. A gemologist and jewelry appraiser assessed the personal items, many of which featured precious stones and metals of exceptional quality. The first expert to arrive was Dr. Richard Morrison, the numismatist from State University. He was a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that trembled slightly with anticipation as Sarah led him down to the basement. She'd reopened the hidden room the night before, working carefully to preserve everything exactly as she'd found it. Dr. Morrison's reaction when he saw the collection was everything Margaret had predicted. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and for a long moment he simply stood in the doorway, staring. Then he laughed, a sound of pure delight. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice shaking, "do you have any idea what you found here?" "No," Sarah admitted. "That's why you're here." Over the next 3 days, Dr. Morrison cataloged every coin in the collection. He worked meticulously, photographing each piece, examining them under magnification, cross-referencing them against historical records and auction databases. Sarah watched him work when she could spare time from her shifts at the diner, fascinated by his dedication and the stories he told about each discovery. "This one," he said, holding up a gold coin carefully with gloved hands, "is an 1854 Liberty Head double eagle. There are only 3 known examples in existence. This would be the 4th. It could sell at auction for 7 figures, possibly more." Sarah felt dizzy. 7 figures? As in millions? "As in potentially several million," Dr. Morrison confirmed. "And that's just one coin. Ms. Bennett, this collection represents decades of careful acquisition by someone who clearly understood what they were doing. These aren't random pieces. This is a curated collection of some of the rarest and most valuable coins in American history." The currency expert, a woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, arrived the following week. She specialized in antique paper money and had worked with the Federal Reserve to authenticate historical currency. Her assessment was equally astounding. "The condition of these bills is extraordinary," she explained to Sarah. "Paper currency degrades much faster than metal coins. The fact that these have been preserved so carefully, protected from moisture and light, makes them exceptionally valuable. This Confederate $100 bill, for instance, in this condition, could be worth $50,000 or more, and you have dozens of them." Sarah had to sit down. The numbers were becoming unreal, too large to comprehend. She'd been worrying about paying a $40 electric bill, and now experts were telling her she had currency worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The jewelry appraiser, Marcus Way, spent 2 full days examining the personal items. He was particularly interested in several pieces that featured elaborate jade carvings and what he identified as imperial Chinese motifs. These pieces are museum quality," Marcus told Sarah and Margaret during his final assessment. "The craftsmanship is exceptional, and the materials are first-rate. Several of these items appear to date from the late Qing dynasty, which ended in 1912. If that's accurate, and if they can be authenticated and their provenance established, each piece could be worth anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000. Sarah's head spun. She'd been so focused on the coins and currency that she hadn't fully appreciated the jewelry. Now, learning that a single necklace could be worth enough to buy several houses, she felt completely overwhelmed. The financial documents proved to be the most surprising discovery. Among them were bonds and stock certificates from companies long since dissolved or absorbed into larger corporations. Some were worthless, but others, after careful research and authentication, proved to have unexpected value as collectibles or through successor companies. Margaret brought in a specialist in historical financial instruments, an elderly man named Theodore Blackwell, who'd spent his career tracking the complex web of corporate mergers, acquisitions, and successions. He worked slowly and methodically, researching each document, tracing corporate lineages, and calculating potential values. "This is fascinating," Theodore told them during one of his update meetings. "Mr. Chen apparently invested quite heavily in railroad companies in the 1950s and 60s. Most of those companies no longer exist in their original form, but several were acquired by conglomerates that are still operating. These shares, if we can establish their legitimacy and navigate the succession process, could have actual monetary value beyond their collectible worth." He showed them a stock certificate for a company called Pacific Rail and Freight. This company was acquired in 1978 by what eventually became part of Burlington Northern Santa Fe. If we can trace the succession properly, these shares might have been converted to shares in the acquiring company, and those shares might have split, merged, and evolved over the decades. It's a complex process, but potentially very lucrative. When the assessments were complete, Margaret called Sarah to her office. Emma was at school, and Sarah had taken the afternoon off, her hands shaking as she sat across from the attorney. "Sarah, I want you to prepare yourself," Margaret said gently. "The preliminary assessments put the total value of the collection at approximately $50 million. Sarah couldn't breathe. The number was so large it didn't seem real. $50 million. She'd been struggling to buy food, to keep Emma in decent clothes, to afford bus fare, and now this. The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, trying to steady herself. "That can't be right," she whispered. "That's not possible." Margaret pushed a glass of water across the desk. "Drink this. Take a breath. I know it's overwhelming." Sarah drank, her hands shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim of the glass. $50 million, she repeated. "Margaret, I don't understand. How can a collection hidden in a basement be worth that much?" "Because Mr. Chen knew what he was doing," Margaret explained patiently. "He wasn't a hoarder who randomly accumulated things. He was a knowledgeable collector who acquired specific items over decades, items that have appreciated significantly in value since he purchased them. The combination of rare coins, historical currency, museum-quality jewelry, and potentially valuable stock certificates creates an extraordinary collection." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the information. "What does this mean? What do I do now?" "However," Margaret continued, "selling the collection properly will take time. Some pieces need to go to auction, others to specialized dealers. The process could take a year or more to maximize value. In the meantime, I can help you arrange a loan against the authenticated value, which will give you immediate access to funds while we work on the sales." A loan, immediate access to funds. Sarah's mind immediately went to practical concerns. "How much could I borrow?" "Given the authenticated value and the quality of the collection, I believe we could secure a loan of several $1,000,000 relatively easily. That would give you working capital to address your immediate needs while we organize the sales process properly." Several $1,000,000. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she hadn't realized she was crying. "I could fix the house properly. I could make sure Emma has everything she needs. I could stop working myself to exhaustion." "Yes," Margaret said gently. "You could do all of those things." Sarah's mind was spinning. "I don't understand. Why me? Why would this happen to me?" Margaret smiled. "Because you took a chance no one else would take. You bought a house everyone else was afraid of. You worked yourself to exhaustion to make it a home. You had the courage to knock down that wall. Sometimes, Sarah, fortune favors the persistent." The next few months transformed Sarah's life in ways she'd never imagined possible. With Margaret's guidance and the initial loan secured against the collection, Sarah hired professional contractors to properly renovate the house. She kept working at the diner, not yet ready to give up the stability of her routine, but she cut back to one job so she could spend more time with Emma. The loan came through 3 weeks after the assessments were completed. Sarah sat in Margaret's office, staring at the bank documents that showed she now had access to $3 million. $3 million? The number looked surreal on the page. "This is real," Margaret said, watching Sarah's face. "This is happening. You can start making decisions about your life based on security rather than survival." Sarah's first decision was practical. She paid off every debt she owed, the back taxes on the house, the utility bills she'd been juggling, the small loans from friends, the credit card debt from emergency repairs. She wrote each check carefully, feeling weight lift from her shoulders with each payment. Her second decision was for Emma. Sarah went to the school and met with the principal, explaining that her financial situation had changed. She enrolled Emma in the music program she'd always wanted to join but couldn't afford. She signed her up for art classes on weekends. She bought her daughter new clothes, not from thrift stores, but from actual children's stores, watching Emma's face light up as she picked out outfits she actually liked. But the most important decision was about the house. Sarah hired a general contractor recommended by Marcus, a woman named Linda Chen, who happened to be Mrs. Chen's niece. Linda was tough, experienced, and honest. She walked through the Victorian house with Sarah, taking notes, pointing out problems Sarah hadn't even known existed. "The foundation needs work in the northwest corner," Linda explained. "The roof needs to be completely replaced, not just patched. All the electrical needs to be brought up to code. The plumbing system works, thanks to George's repairs, but it's old and should probably be replaced entirely to prevent future problems. And we need to test for lid paint and asbestos before we do any major demolition." Linda's estimate for a complete professional renovation came to $400,000. A year ago, that number would have been impossible, laughable even. Now, Sarah could afford it and still have plenty left over for Emma's future and their living expenses. The house began to transform under the skilled hands of professional workers. Linda brought in a crew of experienced craftspeople who treated the Victorian structure with respect, preserving its historical character while modernizing its systems. The foundation was reinforced with steel supports. The roof was stripped down to the rafters and rebuilt with proper insulation and modern materials. New windows were installed, custom made to match the original Victorian style. Sarah made a point of being present during the work, learning from the contractors, understanding what they were doing and why. She taught herself so much during those desperate first weeks, and she wanted to continue learning, to truly understand the house she now owned. The workers grew to respect her. She wasn't an absent owner who wrote checks and disappeared. She was there, asking questions, occasionally helping with tasks, bringing coffee and donuts on cold mornings. She remembered their names, asked about their families, treated them like the skilled professionals they were. One morning, Linda pulled Sarah aside. "I've been doing this for 20 years, she said. I've worked on mansions for millionaires who never bothered to learn my name. But here you are, financially secure, treating my crew with more respect than clients who are worried about every penny. Why?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Because not that long ago I was worried about every penny. I know what it's like to work hard and have people look through you like you're invisible. These people are doing beautiful work on my home. The least I can do is see them and appreciate them." Emma blossomed with the stability and security. Her grades improved dramatically. The anxiety that had shadowed her began to fade, replaced by confidence and joy. Sarah enrolled her in art classes she'd always wanted to take, bought her books without checking the price tags, made sure she had everything she needed and more. But the most profound change was in Emma's sense of security. She stopped having nightmares about being homeless. She stopped hoarding food in her backpack, a habit she'd developed during their worst times. She started inviting friends over, proud to show them her room, her house, her home. One evening, Sarah found Emma drawing at the kitchen table. The picture showed a Victorian house, beautifully detailed, with flowers in the garden and smiling people on the porch. "Is that our house?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her. Emma nodded. "I'm making a picture of how it was and how it is now. See, this is the scary house when we first saw it, and this is our home now. I want to remember both, because the scary part made the good part mean more." Sarah hugged her daughter, fighting tears. "When did you get so wise?" "You taught me," Emma said simply. "You taught me that scary things can become beautiful if you're brave enough to work on them." The renovation took 4 months. During that time, Sarah and Emma lived in the one finished bedroom, but it no longer felt like camping in a disaster zone. It felt like living in a home that was being perfected around them. They'd wake to the sounds of construction, eat breakfast to the rhythm of hammering, and fall asleep to the silence of a house being loved back to life. But Sarah didn't forget where she'd come from, or the people who'd helped her. She paid Marcus and Julio for their time and labor, despite their protests, and hired them to help with additional renovation projects. She gave Tony at the diner money to upgrade the kitchen equipment and create better working conditions for the staff. She worked with Mrs. Chen to organize a neighborhood improvement project, helping other struggling families with home repairs and support services. Word eventually got out about the discovery, though Margaret had managed to keep the exact value confidential. Local news ran a human interest story about the single mother who'd taken a chance on an abandoned house and discovered a valuable collection. The story focused on Sarah's hard work and determination rather than the money, which Sarah appreciated. She turned down requests for interviews on national talk shows, uncomfortable with the attention and worried about Emma's privacy. The sale of the collection proceeded methodically under Margaret's careful management. Rare coins went to specialized numismatic auctions, where collectors from around the world bid against each other. The paper currency, some of it extraordinarily rare, was sold through channels Margaret had cultivated over her years of practice. The jewelry was divided between pieces with historical significance, which went to museums, and pieces valued primarily for their gems and metals, which went to private collectors. By the following spring, a year after Sarah had stood in front of the dilapidated house, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, the sales were largely complete. After taxes, Margaret's contingency fee, and all expenses, Sarah had just over $35 million in secured investments and accounts. She sat with Emma in their renovated kitchen, sunlight streaming through new windows onto refinished wooden floors. The house gleamed around them, transformed from a neighborhood eyesore into a beautiful Victorian home. But more importantly, it felt like a home, their home, filled with memories of hard work, community support, and the beginning of a new life. Mom, Emma said, looking up from her homework, "My teacher wants us to write about what we want to be when we grow up." "What do you want to be?" Sarah asked, sipping coffee from a mug she'd bought without checking the price, still not quite used to that freedom. Emma thought for a moment. "I think I want to help people find homes like you did. Not just houses, but real homes where people feel safe and happy." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. That's a beautiful dream, sweetie. You always told me that home isn't just a place, it's a feeling, Emma continued. And you made that true. Even when this house was scary and broken, it started to feel like home because we were together and you never gave up. Sarah pulled her daughter close. You know what? Before I found that hidden room, before I knew about any of the valuable things in the basement, I already knew I'd made the right choice. Because this house, broken and abandoned as it was, gave us a chance. It gave us a fresh start. The money is wonderful, don't get me wrong, but the real treasure was the opportunity to build something ourselves. It was true. Sarah had learned that the most valuable discoveries weren't always measured in dollars. She'd discovered strength she didn't know she had, found a community willing to support a struggling stranger, and learned that taking risks, even terrifying ones, could lead to transformations beyond imagination. She'd also learned to accept help when it was offered, to trust in the kindness of others, and to pay forward the support she'd received. The money would secure Emma's future, fund her education, provide opportunities Sarah had never had. But more importantly, Emma would grow up knowing that hard work, determination, and the willingness to take chances could change everything. The following year, Sarah started a foundation focused on helping single parents achieve homeownership through down payment assistance, renovation support, and financial education. She worked with Margaret to create a program that identified abandoned or tax delinquent properties and matched them with families willing to put in the work to restore them. The program provided legal support, connected families with contractors and supplies, and offered ongoing education about home maintenance and property management. Setting up the foundation proved more complex than Sarah had anticipated. She worked with Margaret and a team of financial advisors to structure it properly, ensuring that the money would be used effectively and sustainably. They created a board of directors that included Marcus, Tony, and several professionals who volunteered their expertise. Mrs. Chen joined as a community liaison, helping identify families in need and connecting them with resources. Sarah named the foundation Second Chance's Home Initiative, because that's what the house on Elm Street had given her, a second chance when she'd run out of options. The mission statement, which Sarah wrote herself after many late nights of reflection, read, "We believe that everyone deserves a safe place to call home, and that with support, determination, and community, seemingly impossible transformations become possible." The foundation's first client was a young single father named David, who'd been living in his car with his 2 children. Sarah had met him at a local shelter where she'd been volunteering, and his story had struck a chord with her. David had lost his job as a warehouse manager when the company downsized, and a series of medical emergencies for his younger child had drained his savings. Unable to pay rent, he'd been evicted, and the shelter system was overwhelmed and could only offer temporary stays. "I never thought this would happen to me," David told Sarah when they first met. His voice was quiet, ashamed. "I had a good job, savings, a nice apartment. Then everything fell apart so fast. One thing after another, and suddenly I'm living in my car with my kids, hoping no one calls child services and takes them away from me." Sarah saw herself in David's desperation and determination. She saw the same fear in his children's eyes that she'd seen in Emma's when they first moved into the Victorian house. The foundation purchased a small foreclosed house for $5,000 at auction and connected David with contractors who taught him renovation skills while helping make the house livable. The house David would be renovating was in worse condition than Sarah's had been. It was a small ranch-style home in a struggling neighborhood with a collapsed roof, no functioning utilities, and damage from vandals who'd broken in during its abandonment. But the bones were good, the foundation solid, and the neighborhood, though struggling, had families who cared about their community. Sarah visited the property with David and his children, 7-year-old Maya and 5-year-old Jacob, on the day the sale finalized. Maya held her father's hand tightly, her expression wary. Jacob cried and said he wanted to go back to Grandma's house, where they'd been staying temporarily. "I know it looks scary," Sarah told them, kneeling down to their level. "My daughter thought our house was haunted when we first saw it. But you know what? With hard work and help from good people, we turned it into a real home. Your dad is going to do the same thing here, and you're going to help him. Would you like to pick out the color for your bedroom?" Maya's eyes brightened slightly. "Really? We get our own room?" "You get your own rooms," Sarah confirmed. "One for you and one for your brother. What colors do you like?" The transformation in the children's expressions was immediate. Suddenly, the broken house wasn't just a scary place. It was a canvas for their dreams, a space that could become anything they imagined. Sarah arranged for Marcus and his construction crew to work with David on the major structural repairs. George, the retired plumber who'd helped Sarah, came out of retirement again to oversee the plumbing work. A local electrician named Rosa, who'd heard about the foundation through Mrs. Chen, volunteered to handle the electrical system and teach David basic electrical safety and repair. But the most important component of the program wasn't the physical work. It was the community that formed around it. Sarah created a mentorship structure where families who'd already completed renovations helped new families just starting out. She organized workshops on budgeting, home maintenance, and financial planning. She connected families with resources for job training, education, and healthcare. David threw himself into the work with an intensity that reminded Sarah of herself. He worked during the day, learning from the contractors, and in the evenings, after his children were in bed at his mother's house, he'd return to the property and work by lamplight, applying what he'd learned. On weekends, Maya and Jacob came with him, helping with age-appropriate tasks like sorting nails, cleaning up debris, and painting baseboards. Sarah stopped by regularly to check on their progress and provide support. 6 weeks into the renovation, she found David sitting on the front steps, his head in his hands, surrounded by building materials and tools. The children were at his mother's house, and he was alone with his frustration and exhaustion. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, sitting beside him. David gestured at the house. "The roof repair is taking longer than expected because we found rot in more of the rafters than we thought. The plumbing is going to cost more than budgeted because the sewer line needs to be replaced. I'm behind on the timeline we set, and I feel like I'm failing again." Sarah remembered this feeling. The overwhelming sense that the mountain was too high, the task too great, the challenges insurmountable. "You're not failing," she said firmly. "You're learning. Do you know how many times I wanted to give up on my house? There were days I sat exactly where you're sitting now, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But you keep going, David. You solve one problem, then the next, then the next. That's not failing. That's succeeding one step at a time." "What if I can't do this?" David's voice broke. "What if I'm not strong enough? You're living in your car with your children and you haven't given up. You're learning construction skills you never knew you'd need. You're here, covered in dust and exhausted, still fighting. That's the definition of strong enough." David wiped his eyes. "How did you do it? How did you keep going when everything seemed impossible?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I made a promise to my daughter that I'd give her a real home. Every time I wanted to quit, I thought about that promise. You've made that same promise to Maya and Jacob. When the work gets hard, remember why you're doing it." 6 months later, David and his children moved into a safe, warm home they could call their own. Sarah stood with David on the day he received his keys, watching his children run through the empty rooms with joy and excitement, and remembered the first day she'd walked into her own broken house with Emma's hand in hers. The circle of helping continued, expanding outward, touching more lives. Tony, her boss at the diner, asked her one day why she still came to work when she clearly didn't need the money. Sarah had thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because this is where I learned that my value isn't measured by how much money I have or what I own. The people here treated me with respect and kindness when I had nothing but determination. This is my community, and I'm not going to forget that just because my circumstances changed." In the summer, Sarah organized a neighborhood festival celebrating the anniversary of her house purchase. She invited everyone who'd helped her, all the neighbors who'd brought meals and encouragement, the contractors who'd worked for reduced rates or donated time, the professionals who'd guided her through the legal and financial complexities. The Victorian house, now fully restored and beautiful, served as the centerpiece of the celebration. Mrs. Chen, now in her 80s, walked through the house with tears streaming down her face. "My relative, Harold, he was so lonely at the end," she said to Sarah. "He pushed everyone away, lived in fear and isolation. But look what his secrets created. Look at the good that came from it. He would be happy, I think, to know his treasures helped someone build a real home, a real life." Marcus, who'd been promoted to construction supervisor at his company, raised a toast. To Sarah, who taught us all that sometimes the best investments are the ones everyone else is too scared to make. As the party continued around her, Sarah found a quiet moment on the renovated front porch, watching Emma play with the neighborhood children in the yard they'd transformed from overgrown chaos into a welcoming garden. The house rose behind her, solid and beautiful, no longer abandoned or forgotten, but alive with laughter and community. She thought about that October morning when she'd stood in this exact spot, terrified and uncertain, staring at a broken house and wondering if she'd destroyed their lives. She'd had $1, a mountain of debt, and nothing but desperate hope driving her forward. Now she had security, opportunity, and the knowledge that she'd earned everything through her own courage and hard work. The money had changed their circumstances, certainly, but the real transformation had happened before she'd ever found the hidden room. It had happened when she decided to take a chance on a house no one else wanted, when she chose to see possibility instead of decay, when she accepted help from her community and later paid it forward to others. Margaret joined her on the porch, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "You know, I've handled a lot of cases involving found property, inheritance disputes, estate settlements, but I've never seen anything quite like this. Not just the discovery itself, but what you've done with it." Sarah accepted the glass gratefully. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd been too afraid to knock down that wall. If I just focused on the surface renovations and never explored the basement, the treasures would still be sitting there in the dark, useless and forgotten. But you weren't too afraid, Margaret pointed out. That's the difference. You had the courage to look deeper, to push past the obvious and explore what might be hidden. That's a rare quality, Sarah. As the evening fell and the party wound down, Sarah tucked Emma into bed in her beautifully decorated room on the second floor. The house settled around them with comfortable creaks, no longer frightening but familiar and safe. Mom, do you ever miss our old apartment? Emma asked sleepily. Sarah brushed hair back from her daughter's forehead. You know what? I miss the simplicity sometimes. Life is more complicated now, with the foundation and the investments and all the decisions we have to make. But I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. Not the house or the money, but the knowledge that we can overcome anything if we're brave enough to try. And if we have good friends to help us, Emma added. And if we have good friends to help us, Sarah agreed, smiling. After Emma fell asleep, Sarah walked through the quiet house, running her hand along walls she'd scrubbed and painted, over banisters she'd refinished, across floors she'd restored. Every room held memories of the transformation, both of the house and of herself. She ended up in the basement, now clean and organized, converted into a proper storage and utility space. The far corner where the hidden room had been was sealed behind new drywall and paint. No one looking at it would ever guess what secrets it had once held. Sarah had kept one item from the collection, a simple silver locket on a chain, modest compared to the elaborate jewelry they'd sold. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man and woman standing in front of this very house when it was new and beautiful. Harold Chen and his wife, Margaret, had discovered, who died young and left him to grow old alone in the house they'd planned to fill with family. Sarah wore the locket now, a reminder that wealth and possessions meant nothing without people to share them with. Harold had died alone in this house, surrounded by treasures, but impoverished in the ways that truly mattered. Sarah was determined that Emma would grow up differently, understanding that community, connection, and compassion were more valuable than any amount of money. As she climbed the stairs to her own bedroom, Sarah paused at a window overlooking the street. Lights glowed in neighboring houses, families settling in for the evening, the community alive and connected. This was wealth, she thought. This sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than yourself. The next morning, Sarah received a call from a local news producer. A national morning show wanted to do a feature on her story, offering substantial payment for an exclusive interview. Sarah declined politely, as she had all the other media requests. She didn't need the money, and she didn't want the attention. Her story wasn't about the dramatic discovery or the enormous value of the hidden collection. It was about taking chances, working hard, accepting help, and building something meaningful from abandoned ruins. Instead, she spent the day working with her foundation team, reviewing applications from families hoping to enter the homeownership program. Each application represented someone's desperate hope, their willingness to take a chance on themselves despite the odds. Sarah read each one carefully, remembering her own desperation, her own desperate gamble on a broken house. They selected 5 new families for the program, including a young widow with 3 children, a couple who'd lost everything in a fire, and a veteran struggling with physical disabilities and unemployment. Sarah met with each family personally, sharing her own story, explaining the program's requirements and support systems. I can't promise it will be easy, she told them honestly. Renovating a house is hard work, both physically and emotionally. There will be days when you want to give up, when you question every decision you've made. But if you're willing to push through those moments, if you're willing to accept help and work harder than you've ever worked before, you can transform not just a house, but your entire life. Emma, now 8 years old and thriving in school, sometimes accompanied Sarah on these visits. She'd grown up watching her mother's transformation from struggling waitress to confident advocate, and she absorbed the lessons without even realizing it. She was kind to other children at school who struggled, sharing her supplies and offering friendship without hesitation. She understood in a way few children her age could that circumstances could change, but character remained. As the months passed, Sarah watched the Foundation's first families transform their broken houses into homes. She provided support and encouragement, connected them with resources, celebrated their victories, and helped them navigate setbacks. Each family's success felt personal to her, a validation that the model worked, that her own experience wasn't just luck, but a replicable path to stability and security. David, the single father who'd been their first client, eventually got a job with one of the contracting companies Sarah worked with, using skills he'd learned during his renovation. He sent Sarah a text message on the anniversary of his move-in date. 1 year ago, I was living in my car, terrified for my kids' future. Today, I own a home, have a career, and my children are thriving. Thank you for seeing potential in us when we couldn't see it ourselves. These moments, Sarah realized, were the real treasures she'd found in that abandoned house. Not the coins or currency or jewelry, valuable as they'd been, but the opportunity to create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond her own life. The Victorian house on Elm Street became a symbol in the neighborhood, a reminder that transformation was possible, that abandoned and broken things could be restored to beauty and purpose. Children played in the yard Sarah maintained as a community space. Neighbors gathered on the porch for impromptu conversations and planned meetings. The house that had once been shunned and feared was now the heart of a revitalized community. On the second anniversary of her purchase, Sarah stood once again on the front porch. But this time, Emma stood beside her as an equal partner in the foundation's work, rather than a frightened child. They looked out at the neighborhood together, at the lives they'd touched, the families they'd helped, the community they'd strengthened. The neighborhood had transformed along with Sarah's house. The Second Chances Home Initiative had helped 5 families in the area purchase and renovate abandoned properties, and the ripple effect had been remarkable. Other homeowners, inspired by the transformations, had begun improving their own properties. New businesses had opened on the struggling commercial street 2 blocks away. The elementary school had received funding for new programs. Property values had risen, but not so much that longtime residents were being forced out. Mr. Patterson, the neighbor who'd initially complained about Sarah's house being an eyesore, now served on the foundation's advisory board. He'd never apologized for his early hostility, but his actions spoke louder than words. He used his background in accounting to help foundation families create budgets and financial plans. He'd become, in his gruff way, a fierce advocate for the program. "Do you remember being scared that first day?" Sarah asked her daughter. Emma laughed. "I thought it was a haunted house from a horror movie, but you know what? In a way it was haunted by loneliness and secrets and waste. We didn't get rid of the ghosts by running away. We got rid of them by filling the house with life and purpose and community." Sarah hugged her daughter close, marveling at her wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" "I learned from the best," Emma replied simply. The party that evening was in full swing. Marcus had brought his new girlfriend, a teacher at Emma's school. Tony had closed the diner early so his whole staff could attend. George and Tyler, the plumbers who'd saved Sarah's basement, demonstrated their latest invention, a water-saving shower head they'd designed together. Mrs. Jen held court on the porch, telling stories about the neighborhood's history to anyone who would listen. David arrived with Maya and Jacob, who'd grown so much in the past year. Maya, now 8, was thriving in school and had joined the same art program as Emma. The 2 girls had become close friends, bonding over their shared experience of renovation and transformation. Jacob, 6 years old, ran immediately to the backyard where other children were playing. "Thank you for being here," Sarah told David, pulling him aside for a moment. "Are you kidding?" David replied. "I wouldn't miss this. Sarah, you saved our lives. I mean that literally. We were living in my car, I was about to lose custody of my kids, and I'd given up hope. You gave us a path forward." "You saved yourselves," Sarah corrected gently. "I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and did the hard work." David shook his head. "It's more than that. You showed me it was possible. You proved that people like us, people who'd fallen through the cracks, could build something real. That changed everything." Later in the evening, Margaret found Sarah in the kitchen, where she'd gone to refill the punch bowl. The attorney looked elegant in a blue dress, so different from the business suit Sarah was used to seeing her wear. "This is quite a success story," Margaret said, helping Sarah carry the heavy bowl. 2 years ago, you were terrified you'd made a mistake buying this house. Now look at it. Look at what you've built, and I don't just mean the physical structure." Sarah looked around at the party happening in her home. Friends, neighbors, families she'd helped, contractors who'd become friends, all gathered in the house that had once been an abandoned eyesore. I still can't believe it sometimes. I wake up and think it's all a dream, that I'm going to find myself back in that studio apartment with $40 to my name. "It's not a dream," Margaret said firmly. "You earned this, every bit of it, and you're using it to create more success stories, more transformations. That's the real treasure, Sarah. Not the money, but what you're doing with it." The sale of the collection had progressed steadily throughout the year. The rare coins had gone to specialized auctions, where collectors from around the world competed fiercely. The 1854 Liberty Head double eagle that Dr. Morrison had identified sold for $3.7 million to a private collector in Switzerland. Other coins, while not as spectacularly rare, still commanded impressive prices. The paper currency had sold through specialized dealers, with some pieces going to museums for their historical significance. The Confederate currency, perfectly preserved, had been particularly valuable. Several pieces had sold for over $100,000 each. The jewelry had been divided between museums and private collectors. The imperial Chinese pieces that Marcus Way had identified went to a museum in San Francisco for their historical and cultural significance. Sarah had negotiated a deal where the museum purchased the items at fair market value, and in return, the collection would be displayed with information about Harold Chen's life and legacy. It felt right to honor the man whose hidden treasures had changed her life. The stock certificates had proven to be the most complex and time-consuming to liquidate. Theodore Blackwell had spent months tracing corporate successions and establishing the legitimacy of the shares. Some had proven worthless, but others had unexpected value. The Pacific Rail and Freight shares had indeed been converted through a series of mergers and acquisitions, and after all the calculations and legal wrangling, they were worth nearly $2 million. By the end of the process, after taxes, fees, and all expenses, Sarah had deposited just over $35 million into secured investments and accounts. Margaret had connected her with financial advisors who specialized in helping lottery winners and sudden inheritors manage their money responsibly. Sarah had learned about trusts, investment strategies, tax implications, and the importance of not letting wealth corrupt values. As Sarah reflected on the journey from that terrifying October morning to this moment of peace and purpose, she understood that the real value of her discovery wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in transformed lives, including her own. She'd bought an abandoned house for $1 and found $50 million in the basement. But the true treasure was the courage to take that first step, the strength to see it through, and the wisdom to use her good fortune to lift others up alongside her. Emma found her mother standing alone on the porch as the party wound down, watching the last guests say their goodbyes. "You okay, Mom?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "I'm better than okay. I'm grateful for all of this, but especially for you. You're the reason I took that chance on this house. You're the reason I kept going when I wanted to quit. Everything good that came from this started with wanting to give you a better life." "You did that," Emma said simply. "You gave me the best life, not because of the money or the nice house, but because you showed me what it means to be brave and kind and to never give up on what matters." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle in for the night. Lights glowed in windows up and down the street. In several of those houses lived families that the Second Chances Home Initiative had helped. Each light represented a story of transformation, of courage rewarded, of community support making the impossible possible. The house stood behind them, solid and beautiful, no longer a symbol of decay and abandonment, but of hope, transformation, and the extraordinary possibilities that await those brave enough to take chances on broken things and see their potential for beauty. And every day, Sarah walked through its rooms grateful not just for what she'd found there, but for what she'd become in the finding. A woman who discovered that the greatest treasures are the ones we create through our choices, our courage, and our commitment to making the world better than we found it. The foundation continued to grow. By the third year, they'd helped 23 families achieve homeownership. The success rate was remarkable. Unlike traditional homeownership programs that simply provided down payment assistance, the Second Chances program created a support system that carried families through the entire process and beyond. Sarah had learned that buying a house was just the beginning. The real challenge was maintaining it, dealing with unexpected repairs, managing budgets, and building the skills needed to be successful homeowners. So the foundation provided ongoing support, connecting families with resources, offering workshops, and creating a network where experienced homeowners could mentor new ones. The model attracted attention from housing advocates and urban planners. Sarah was invited to speak at conferences, to share her story and her program's approach. She was uncomfortable with public speaking at first, but Margaret encouraged her to see it as an opportunity to expand the program's reach and influence policy. At one conference in Washington, D.C., Sarah stood before an audience of hundreds of housing professionals and policymakers. Her hands shook as she approached the podium, but then she thought about David and his children, about the widow with 3 kids who now owned a renovated bungalow, about the veteran who'd found purpose in rebuilding a broken house while rebuilding his life. 2 years ago, I bought an abandoned house for $1, Sarah began. Not because I was brave or visionary, but because I was desperate and out of options. I had no idea what I was doing. I was terrified. But I learned something important through that experience. The gap between impossible and possible isn't as wide as we think. It's crossed by courage, community support, and the willingness to work harder than you've ever worked before. She talked about the foundation, about the model they'd developed, about the families they'd helped. But mostly, she talked about the power of seeing potential in broken things, whether those things were houses or people or communities. The speech was well received. Afterward, several city officials approached Sarah about replicating the program in their communities. A philanthropist offered to fund an expansion. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell the foundation's story. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also excited by the possibilities. Emma, now 9 years old, sometimes complained that her mother was too busy with the foundation. Sarah took those complaints seriously, carving out dedicated time for just the two of them. They had weekly movie nights, just mother and daughter. They took trips together, exploring nearby cities and national parks. Sarah made sure that Emma understood she was still the priority, still the reason for everything. On Emma's 10th birthday, Sarah surprised her with a special present. It wasn't expensive or elaborate. It was a photo album filled with pictures Sarah had taken throughout their journey. The first page showed the Victorian house on that first day, dilapidated and frightening. The subsequent pages showed the transformation week by week, month by month. There were photos of Emma helping with renovations, of the helpers who'd supported them, of the finished house in all its beauty. The last page had 2 photos side by side. One showed Sarah and Emma on their first day at the house, both looking scared and uncertain. The other showed them on the restored porch 2 years later, both smiling, confident, and happy. "I want you to have this," Sarah told Emma as she looked through the album with tears in her eyes. "So you always remember where we came from and how we got here. Not just the discovery in the basement, but the work we did before we even knew it existed. That's the real story. The discovery was luck. Everything before and after was us." Emma hugged her mother tightly. "I'll never forget. And when I grow up, I want to help people like you do. I want to show them that broken things can be beautiful." The house on Elm Street had become more than a home. It was a symbol, a gathering place, and a reminder that transformation was always possible. Sarah sometimes walked through its rooms late at night when Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, running her hands along the restored woodwork, remembering the journey. She thought about Harold Chen, the lonely man who'd hidden his treasures and died alone. Sarah had learned more about him through research and conversations with Mrs. Chen. He'd come to America full of dreams, had built a successful business, had married and planned a life full of joy. But his wife had died young, and grief had turned him inward, had made him afraid to connect with others. He'd accumulated wealth, but died impoverished in the ways that mattered most. Sarah wore his locket still, the simple silver piece with the faded photograph. It reminded her that wealth without love was meaningless, that treasures hidden away helped no one, that the real value of anything came from how it was used to create connection and community. As the foundation's impact grew, Sarah received recognition she never sought or expected. The mayor presented her with a community service award. A national magazine featured her in an article about innovative approaches to affordable housing. A university invited her to be a guest lecturer in their urban planning program. But the recognition that meant the most came from the families she'd helped. They sent her photos of their children thriving in stable homes. They invited her to birthday parties and graduations. They told her stories about how homeownership had changed not just their living situations, but their sense of possibility, their children's futures, their entire trajectories. The Victorian house on Elm Street stood as a testament to what was possible when courage met opportunity, when community supported individual effort, when broken things were seen not as beyond salvation, but as full of potential. And at its heart was a truth Sarah had learned through her journey. The greatest discoveries aren't always tangible. Sometimes the most valuable treasure is the transformation that happens when we dare to take chances on things everyone else has given up on, when we choose to see beauty in decay and possibility in abandonment. Sarah Bennett had bought an abandoned house for $1 and found $50 million in the basement, but that wasn't the story she told when people asked about her success. The real story was about a desperate single mother who refused to give up, a community that chose to help rather than judge, a determination to turn broken things into beauty, and the wisdom to understand that the true measure of wealth isn't what you have, but what you do with it to make the world better.